Morning. Morning. Welcome to what's easily one of my favorite days of every year. That is the U.S. Grant Symposium that we've been hosting here at Soldiers Memorial since I first met Greg in 2019. It's always a educational day. It's a fun day. And it's one that I look forward to. So I'm Mark Sunlove. I'm the director here of Soldiers Memorial on behalf of the Missouri Historical Society. I welcome you. I want to thank all of the, if there's any members here of the Missouri Historical Society, certainly want to thank you and thank you for your support. We simply can't do programs like this without your continued support. So thank you very much. This year is a little bit different for us. In the past 10 years, the Missouri Humanities Council has led the way on this program. In speaking with their CEO, Ashley Beard-Fosno, this winter, we had agreed to transfer responsibility for the organization and coordination from the Humanities Council to Soldiers Memorial and the Missouri Historical Society. It was a program that we all agreed, both the Humanities Council and the Soldiers Memorial, that we did not want to see end or go away in any form whatsoever. So working with Greg and the U.S. Grant Trail Association, we're keeping it going. And so we're really, really proud of this program and happy to be here. Greg does so much work on this program, and it's really kudos to him for, the most important part are the speakers, right? The content of the day is really what matters the most, and that's all the legwork of Greg and the coordination that Greg puts into it, his networks and his connections. So I want to thank him so much for the work that he's done, his commitment to the success of the National U.S. Grant Trail Association, and its future is bright, and we're proud to be a part of that. But at this moment, I'd like to turn it over to Greg. And Greg, if you'd like to come up.
And thank you, Mark. And but believe me, it is a labor of love. And I think everybody in the room probably, well, love's too strong a term, but everybody likes Ulysses Grant, right? Yes, sir. That's why we're here. Welcome to the 11th installment of the U.S. Grant Symposium. I mentioned my friend Bob here that perhaps he's the only one besides me who's been to all 11, but if anybody else has, let me know. We'll give you a special award. But I'm very, very pleased and proud the way that this event has evolved. And hopefully it's going to be going on every year for the foreseeable future. And we shall see. Let me say also thank you to the Soldiers Memorial Military Museum, this wonderful venue that we've been here probably the last 7 years with the Missouri Historical Society as the host as opposed to a partner, but now I'm real excited about partnering with them. So I've got those of you who have been to one of these before realize that I always have a little bit of a story to tell because I guess I love stories. So before I introduce our first speaker, I wanted to talk a little bit about this. We usually theme our symposium based upon the subject of our keynote speaker. And I might say this year it is very, very special because the keynote speaker actually created the theme by voting and pushing the legislation in Congress that got Ulysses Grant in this kind of company. And of course, you know who is on the right. But the story that I have to tell is, when I will look forward to introducing Senator Blunt after lunch. But my story has to do, first of all, with those of you who might remember back in the 70s a program, I think it was PBS, some Brit named James Burke did something called Connections. Anybody? I've got a nod there. I've got a nod there. It's actually now streaming, so I've got it on top of my mind. But what James Burke did was to take disparate events and like weave them together like it was a piece of cloth, let's say, and came up with some surprising conclusions about how some things relate to another. And this cloth of history kind of means that if you pull a little thread over here, you might see something happen way over there, but hey, it's related. So anyway, my introduction is I will impersonate James Burke and mention this. In September of 1860, a child was born on a farm outside of Laclede, Missouri. The boy's father was a track boss on the great Hannibal and St. Joseph Railroad as that was being built across Missouri. The boy's mother was a belle from Warrenton, Missouri, and the two of them met and married in Warrenton while this boy's father was a track boss on a different railroad, the one that we now call the Norfolk Southern. When that boy was 10 months old, a man arrived at the Hannibal and St. Joe Railroad as well, at a spot where the rebels had destroyed a railroad bridge. And the first post that he had in a war zone during the Civil War was at the site 70 miles east of where the boy was born. Now the boy and the man are two of the 3 6-star generals in all of American history, and those are the two. And we, of course, as those of you who've been here before know, we claim Grant as a Missourian. So, and I didn't mean to leave George Washington out, but as far as I know, he never was in Missouri and never knew Ulysses Grant. So, with that said, it is my pleasure to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Diana Carlin. Diana is a professor emeritus from St. Louis University, but I believe that was somewhat late in your academic career. She's been involved in communications departments at the University of Kansas for over 20 years, and she moved to St. Louis University and was, I think, in charge of the international student program. She's active in the White House Historical Association of Washington, as well as the First Ladies Association of Research and Education. And she has authored with some co-authors a book called The First Ladies Making History and Leaving Legacies. Okay, it's recently published within the last year. She'll have some books available at lunchtime and to take a look at and buy if you would like to. But she also very currently has done an article in the Journal of the First Ladies Association called The General's Wives, 3 First Ladies Shaped by the Military, Martha Washington, there's that name again, Julia Grant, and Mamie Eisenhower. So she comes to us now to explain how she feels and what she can tell us about Julia Dent Grant.
Thank you, Greg and Mark, for the invitation, and Julie Northrup, thank you for suggesting that I be here today, and thank you, all of you, for being here. I gave a presentation at the historic site in February, and for those of you who were there, I've talked to a couple people who were, this is a totally different speech. So don't worry that you're going to get a repeat performance. I don't typically do the same thing everywhere. I kind of adjust what I'm doing. As Greg said, I'm a First Ladies scholar, and I've been studying First Ladies for about 35 years. I got interested in them actually as a child when I was reading women's biographies and read a biography of Martha Washington and one of Abigail Adams, and just became sort of infatuated. And then I was very young when Jackie Kennedy was First Lady and was sort of mesmerized by her. And so I started teaching a course at the University of Kansas on women in politics. And I realized the first women in politics in this country were the First Ladies. And so I began developing a unit in that course on First Ladies, and my students liked it so much that I then developed an entire course on First Ladies. And there were no textbooks, so a year ago, a textbook that Greg mentioned came out. But then 6 months later, a book called Remember the First Ladies, and that's the one I spoke about and I have today. It's for the general public. So we have quite a bit on Julia Grant in there. So I kind of came to this particular topic about Julia today from several directions. One, I was at the Eisenhower Museum 5 years ago, and I was at a dinner, and their granddaughter, youngest granddaughter, Mary Jane, who I got to know well when she was running People for People to People in Kansas City, and I was doing international work at Kansas. We were having dinner, and they were saying, well, what's your latest project? And I'd just written a book chapter about Martha Washington and her influence on the position of First Lady. And they said, you know, and I said, the military, of course, shaped her so much. And they said, well, it did Mamie, too. I said, yeah. And I said, and Julia Grant had to have been shaped by the military. So it got me digging into that. And I then developed an Osher lifelong learning course, which I've taught online several times, on the generals' wives. White House Historical Associations, their quarterly journal, the one that just came out about 6 weeks ago that Greg mentioned, I then took my course and condensed it into a chapter for that quarterly on the generals' wives. And so Julia was definitely a part of that. So that was really how I came to really begin to focus on Julia, because I hadn't paid as much attention to her as some of the later First Ladies who I'd written about. And I've become very intrigued with her. And then, of course, I've spent time at the historic site looking for everything about Julia. And then when it was time to write the 2 books, I took the Julia part of the book to write and did everything I could to really get her story out. So that was how I came to it. And right now I am wrapping up a chapter about her memoir. And so that is my next project, is finishing up this chapter on Julia's memoir and looking at why she wrote it, what it really does to present Ulysses Grant and his story. So that's really what I want to concentrate on today, is Julia's memoir and what it tells us about him. But I didn't just leave it to Julia's memoir. Different people have different memories. And I remember when my parents celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, their parish priest did a blessing and said that we were celebrating 100 years of marriage, the 50 of my mother's and the 50 of my father's, because they were very different. And the Grants would fit into that category. So there are 3 things that I've used that I've drawn from on this topic. And one is a book called My Dearest Julia. Have any of you looked at that? It's got a couple, 85 letters that he wrote to her over the period of time from 1844 until 1848 when they married, then when they were separated during their early marriage, and then during the Civil War, and especially when he was out in California. Wonderful letters, and they present a picture of Ulysses S. Grant that's very different from, I think, what you get from his memoir. His memoir, of course, I used to see if he and Julia saw the same situations the same way. And I found some overlap, but I also found some differences. And then the final one was Julia's her memoir, which was really the first major memoir written by a First Lady, but it didn't get published until 1975. Have any of you read Julia's memoir? Okay, a few hands up here. I'm sure many of you have read Ulysses Grant's memoir. Yeah. So those are the three things that I've drawn on, and I'm going to read bits and pieces from some of them. So the relationship. This picture is of Julia a little later. I didn't find a really good one. James, you probably know where they are. A really good one of her from her younger days. But this picture of Ulysses Grant would be pretty much what he looked like when she first met him. And they met as a result of several things. Her brother was his roommate at West Point. And Frederick Dent wrote to his parents and family about this roommate who he thought was going to go on to great things. So after graduation from West Point, as you know, Grant was stationed at Jefferson Barracks. And Frederick, who was not stationed at Jefferson Barracks, told him, if you need to feel like you're with a family, go visit mine. And since it wasn't that long a ride, and Grant writes in his memoir that he'd brought his own horse and saddle to Jefferson Barracks, he would every week go out to spend time with the Dent family and got to, feel very comfortable with them. One of the things that I think is important to note about the Grants is that they were both very family oriented. And I noticed in the list of past speakers that Pamela Sanfilippo, who has written a couple of book chapters about Julia, did a presentation at one of your symposiums on the importance of family. And that was really one of the things that I think drew them together. In the introduction to the book of letters, Bruce Catton wrote, it was a sort of classic mismatch that through love's strange alchemy sometimes yields marital bliss. And he wrote that about the Grants, seeing them as two very different personalities. But as I went through his letters, his memoir, her memoir, and some of the biographies, they were really more alike than you would think. And one of those things that really drew them together was this dedication to family and the importance of family. And throughout Grant's entire career, family was incredibly important to him. So Julia had also read a book. Julia was a reader, and so was Ulysses Grant. And in fact, when they were separated for 4 years during the Mexican War, his letters refer to, did you get the magazine I sent you? Did you get the book I sent you? And Julia wrote in her memoir, Lieutenant Grant was continuously sending me reading material. And they would read together when they were together. They also enjoyed nature. And this was one of the things that began attracting him to her, was that they would take these rides all around the Dent's 1,000 acres. And he said he came to know pretty much every part of that territory near the Dent house and among their neighbors. So they had these idyllic kinds of rides where they would talk about literature, talk about their families, and they came to be very good friends. He wrote in his journal and his memoir, it's the right page here, I soon found my way out to Whitehaven, the name of the Dent estate. As I found the family congenial, my visits became frequent. There were at home 2 daughters, but there was an older daughter of 17 who had been spending several years at a boarding school in St. Louis, the Mrs. Morrow's school, which was a finishing school, and Julia and her sister attended. And he said, in February, she returned to her country home. After that, I do not know, but my visits became more frequent. They certainly did become more enjoyable. We often would take walks or go on horseback to visit neighbors until I became well acquainted with the vicinity. And Julia, in her memoir, also talked about meeting him and how he started coming daily to visit them after. But they both didn't realize that what they felt was love. And interestingly, in their memoirs, they both kind of described this epiphany that they had, that there was more to this than just friendship and congeniality. And he wrote, if the 4th Infantry had remained at Jefferson Barracks, it is possible, even probable, that this life might have continued for some years without my finding out that there was anything serious the matter with me. But in the following May, a circumstance occurred which developed my sentiment so palpably that there was no mistaking it. And that was when he was going to be transferred to the South and then eventually transferred to Mexico for the Mexican War. And when he realized he would not be seeing Julia daily, he then realized he had fallen in love with her. And Julia, who was not interested in men and not interested in marriage as an 18-year-old, she was 18, he was 22 when they met, didn't really think she was old enough to be that romantically involved. And she wrote similarly that she had not really thought about how serious this relationship was until he left Jefferson Barracks on a leave to go to see his parents. And it was while he was there that they got the orders to go south. And someone then told her, if he comes back within a week, then you will see him. If he doesn't, it means it's on his way down the Mississippi to his next post. So she went to the barracks by herself, which was a pretty daring thing for her, and she talked about that, to see if he had come back so that he could go out with his brigade. And he didn't. And she wrote that she left and felt alone. Well, he did come back. Somebody warned him to not open any letters with his new orders so that he would not disrupt his visit. So he didn't know, he never got the letter saying that he was supposed to report immediately and that his leave was over. So when he got back, the first thing he did was go see Julia. And she had had a dream. Julia was huge on dreams. She believed that her dreams were prophetic and they became very important and that she had premonitions. And she had gotten a new bed with 4 posters. And in this bed, there was a tradition that on the first night you named the posters after someone. And she named one of them for Grant. And then she dreamt about him. And she believed that if she dreamt about somebody she'd named one of the 4 posters for, that dream would come true. And she dreamt that he showed up at their house. And I should probably move that slide forward. I think many of you have been out there. But this is where they met, and the house, and this is the room where they would have first met. So she dreamt that he came riding up to the house in civilian clothes that didn't fit him very well, and that he said he was going to be there for a week before he left to join his company. Well, a week later, he showed up in civilian clothes that he'd borrowed from her brother because she dreamt that he had fallen into a creek and had gotten his uniform wet, and that's exactly what happened. So this made her even more convinced that she had this kind of touch of prophecy. But he came, he stayed a week, and then he joined and went off to prepare to go to the Mexican War. So they both then realized that there was something going on here. And he then described how he said, before I returned, I mustered up courage to make known in the most awkward manner imaginable the discovery I had made on learning that the 4th Infantry had been ordered away from Jefferson Barracks. The young lady afterwards admitted that she too, although until she had never looked upon me other than as a visitor whose company was agreeable to her, had experienced the depression of spirits she could not account for when the regiment left. And then he explained that he'd offered her his West Point ring, which he had offered before he went to visit his parents. And she said, no, I'm not interested. And my mother would never allow this. When he came back and she realized she was in love with him, she accepted the ring, but said, we're not going to tell our parents that we're doing this. So she hid the engagement. He had one trip back during the 4 years that he was away from her. And during that time, he then asked her parents for her hand. And what was really interesting about her parents was her mother absolutely adored him and believed he was going to go on for great things. Her father liked him, thought he was great company, but he wasn't as assured as her mother that he was going to go on for greatness. But he also didn't think Julia was cut out for a military life. And so when Grant asked if he could continue to correspond with her and that if, once this war ended, if they could marry, Father said, well, you're still young. We'll kind of conditionally approve that you can continue to talk about this wedding, but, we're not sure it'll ever happen, but fine. If this is what you want to believe and it makes you happy, that's great. He said, but, we have another daughter who is much better suited to the military than Julia. And so there's this funny stuff in some of the letters about, and in Julia's memoir about how her father tried to give, this other sister away to Grant, but he was not interested in her sister. And it was a sister-in-law who he teased a lot. And there was a lot in the letters about ugly Nellie, ugly Ellen, and is she giving our little boy a bad time, that type of thing. But Julia said, no, I can do this. He can make me happy. So during the war, part of what really was the attraction was that their personalities were different. Bruce Catton was right about that. She was much more outgoing, very optimistic, naive in many ways, a hopeless romantic. The fact that this dashing lieutenant, this book she read called The Dashing Lieutenant, had, as a teenager when she was at Miss Murrow's school, had made her want to find that dashing lieutenant. And she wrote when he was about the time he decided to run for the White House. And she didn't really originally want him to run for president because she said, a soldier had always been my ideal. And she wanted him to continue to be the head of the armies because that was really how she viewed him. And all through the memoir, she doesn't refer to him as the president, hardly at all. It's the general. And this is how she talks about him throughout the memoir because he was her general and he was the soldier. And that was how she viewed him. And so Julia was going to support this, even if it killed her in some ways. And so during these letters, during the Mexican War, he was very nervous that she would change her mind, that there were other suitors who would come after her who were there at Jefferson Barracks. And he heard a rumor that some other woman had said that he was really in love with this other woman and not with Julia. And if she heard that rumor, it wasn't true. And so there's all this angst and this missing her. And part of it was just this ebullient personality she had, that everything was always positive. And so she gave Grant that sense of positivity and optimism. And you can tell that once again from the letters, how much he misses her, how he needs to have her near him, and how he wishes that she could be there. And at one point she responds saying, I would live in a tent to be with you. And he writes, he goes, that made me so happy that you would say that because you understand how important it is that you are with me. And so he also revealed something that Julia tapped into that became very important during the Civil War. And that was this sense of honor and duty that he had, but also this goodness and this real disdain for some of what went on during the war. And he wrote in his memoir about some of the atrocities that American soldiers were committing in Mexico, and he was appalled by them. He talked about one of the generals under whose command he was, and how he was a famous general in both the Mexican War and the Civil War. And he said, I consider both of those unholy wars. And so she understood that he needed some diversion from what was going on with war. And so this was why she was with him as often as she could be during the Civil War. And this is why she left her home. When they got married in 1848, August 22nd, 1848, she had a week to get the wedding planned, but like she said, she had 4 years to think about it. So she was able to plan it in a week. And they had a small wedding. And then they took off. He had a 2-month leave, and they went, her first time to ever leave the St. Louis area. And they visited his family in Kentucky. They visited his family in Ohio. And, his family did not come to the wedding because they were abolitionists, and they did not approve. And there were many heated discussions between Grant and his father-in-law about the issue. And it was one of those things that Julia was able to gloss over, because in her mind, they treated their enslaved workers well. They were part of the family. And so she didn't see it as the evil that he did. And they found a way to deal with that. And he told her when the war started that it was important that the enslaved workers who she had been assigned to, everybody hearing me okay? Okay, that's good. Make sure that's coming. That she needed to free them because slavery was going to end, and he wanted them freed. And they eventually were with the Emancipation Proclamation. But what she was able to do then was provide a distraction. And so the children were often with them. when they were first married, and it was time then to go to his first posting, and they were Detroit and Sackett's Island, New York, were his first couple postings. She then realized she had never really left home, and she was crying and didn't want to leave her father, who had spoiled her because she was the first daughter. And her father said, well, then, you can stay here, and the lieutenant can come visit you periodically. And yes? Oh, okay. Okay, that's fine. Okay. All right. And he said, so Ulysses, she says in her memoir, he leaned over, put an arm around her, and he said, is this what you want to do? I thought now, after 4 years, we were finally together, and we would be together almost every day. And she goes, no, I'm going to go with you. And she said that was the most difficult decision she ever made. But she was this eternal optimist, so when they get to these postings, the first thing she's going to do is be a good military wife. And she understood that he had people under his command, and she needed to make them comfortable. So they became basically the epicenter of the social life at whatever post they were both at. And she didn't know how to cook. She didn't know how to do anything because they'd had servants. And so she learned the basics, but she was basically there to provide relief for him. And that was what she did during the Civil War also when she would go visit him. And there was a really telling point about how important she was to him to overcome the horrors of war. And that was when she was at one of his posts during the Civil War. She was going to the hospital tents, and she was helping tend to the soldiers. Mary Lincoln did the same thing. And she would come home and tell him, and he forbade her to go back. And she wrote about this in her memoir, that he told her, please do not do this anymore, because I need to have time in my life to forget it. And you and the children provide that relief for me. So I don't want you going to the hospitals anymore. And so she agreed, even though it pained her because she felt like she was doing something important, contributing to the war effort. But she knew the more important thing for her to do was to contribute to some security for him so that he could do his job. And she really understood the role of a military wife because of that. And so this was, part of what she did. She encouraged him. Oh, this was one of their posts, and this is their dining room. And she wrote effusively about the wonderful dinners they all shared there. A little behind on the slides. Other military residence. One of the letters he wrote that really showed how much he missed family was from California. And we all know that he eventually resigned his commission because he could not stand to be away from her. And all of his letters during that time basically said, I cannot tolerate this. It is not a tolerable situation. And so he kept asking her for a picture of the children. And I don't know for sure that she actually sent this to him, but this is what he asks her for in one of the letters, because the younger boy, Ulysses, he had never met. She was not with him on the West Coast because she was pregnant with their second child, and she could not make the trip to California or to the West Coast. And so he had never seen this child. And these letters are full of angst about not having seen this child, and that the older child, Fred, would have forgotten him by the time he finally got home. And when he did write his letter of resignation, and he wrote to Julia, it was because I need to be back with my family. And he wrote in his memoir that that was the reason he left, was that his life just was not what it needed to be without his family. And as you know, during that time, that's when the rumors started about drinking. And Julia vehemently defends him in the memoir. And so this is some examples of how he needed the family together with him during the war. And I'm sure, James, you have lots more to show from that period. But that became incredibly important to him, to have family nearby. And he also was very much interested in their education. So these family portraits tell a lot about how important family was to both of them and how he needed his family near him. Then we get to the White House years. And as I said, she originally didn't want him to run for president. But he explained to her, and she talks about this in her memoir, that it was important to unify the country. And he talked about what a mess Andrew Johnson had made of it. And that she then came to believe that he was the person who could unify the country. And she then wrote, she became enthusiastic, even though she didn't understand or like politics, and that any time she had to be there with him during this election, that she would be there. And so she then embraced the whole thing. And during the White House years, they were seen as the most affectionate couple that anyone had ever seen in public. Their PDA was actually embarrassing to some people during this kind of prim and proper Victorian period. But they were affectionate and definitely were. And the letters, their early letters, she would send rose petals to him in letters that she had kissed. And he would then kiss the rose petals. I mean, is this the general you think about? No. I mean, he also had this incredibly romantic side. And so they were very affectionate. She also understood, and Catton wrote about this, if the early letters especially, you saw this man who was still trying to figure out who he was and had some insecurities. And Julia understood that. And she drew him out. And so she talked about what she used to do at White House receptions. And that was, if he was kind of off on the side and not communicating, like she would start telling a story about something from his military career or life, and she'd purposely tell it incorrectly. And he would then come over to correct it. And then he would take over, and she would step back and let him have center stage. And that was what she understood about him, and it really becomes clear. Unfortunately, we don't have her letters to him because, like the Washingtons, she burned her letters to him. But she couldn't bear to part with his letters to her, especially after his, passing. That was what she had left of him. And so, she wanted then to do what she could because she understood unifying the country was important. And once again, he wrote in his memoir about this and how important this was, and he wrote about Andrew Johnson and some of the mistakes. So one of the things she did was what I call China diplomacy. This is taken from one of the displays at the Grant Historic Site. She had New China, created. And the China had the state flowers of every one of the states. And her idea was that she would set tables with the North and the South flowers side by side. I have allergies that St. Louis brings out in major force. Some of you are nodding, yeah. So this was a little thing that Julia did that she thought would help with unification. She also took a page out of Dolly Madison, and their receptions were bipartisan, Republicans and Democrats. And of course, she did that partially because her father was a dyed-in-the-wool Democrat. And she had to be very careful about who was sitting by her father when some of the Republicans were at dinner, because he would get a little upset about some of the things they were saying about some of the Democrats. So she tried to be the peacemaker. But the other thing she did that showed her diplomacy was Julia Tyler, who was originally a Northerner, became a Southern patriot. And, we know her husband, Tyler, gave up his U.S. citizenship, and Julia sided with the Confederate cause. And she wanted a pension because after the Civil War, the Tyler fortune was gone. And she had 7 kids to support. And she's a widow now. And so she wants a pension, and she's up there all the time trying to get a pension. And she showed up at the White House unannounced one day. And before she had left the White House, she was only First Lady for 8 months, Julia Tyler. She had had this incredible portrait done of her, which is one of the most beautiful portraits in the White House by an Italian portrait artist. And she had she gave it to Andrew Johnson and asked him to start a First Lady's gallery. He put it in the attic. Julia Grant started going through the attic looking for furniture, because one of the things you have to know about the White House is that Congress never gave them enough money for anything. And so they had to oftentimes bring their own furniture in, and then they sold it or took it home or whatever. So furniture was kind of tough to come by. So Julia was scrounging around. And finds this gorgeous, gorgeous portrait of Julia Tyler. And she puts it in the family quarters above the piano. And so Julia Tyler comes to the White House unannounced one day when she's up trying to get her pension from Congress. They eventually gave, and Mary Lincoln was furious with her for wanting a pension when she had betrayed the United States, and Mary was trying to get a pension. So Congress diplomatically gave pensions to Mary Lincoln, Julia Tyler, and Sarah Polk. And Sarah Polk remained neutral during the Civil War, so both North and South were visiting her place in Tennessee. So they asked Julia Grant, should we let her in? And she goes, she used to live here, of course she can come in. So she let her come in, she provided tea for her, showed her the portrait, and that was another thing that Julia Grant did to try to ease the tensions. And later, she and Verena Davis, Jefferson Davis's widow, became friends in New York. So Julia really saw part of her role to support her husband using the kind of diplomacy that first ladies use. And that's the hostess situation, things like China. And Julia understood that. And that's part of why Ulysses Grant was attracted to her, because she had some insights into people and situations. And once again, that comes through in all three of those. So these are the portraits that are at the historic site. And then this is a portrait of the later years with some of the grandchildren. And the last is one of the later pictures of Julia. Why did she write her memoir? She wrote it for several reasons. She originally wrote it because her son Frederick thought that her husband's memoir had come out, and he wrote it so that she would have money to live on. And so she was well taken care of. I think the first, in the book, Remember the First Ladies, I did some transcription of what the original sales would be in $24, $12 million. So Julia was well set. He knew she had, pretty expensive tastes, and that he would need to take care of her, plus the rest of the family. So her son said, you need to write your memoir. You need to write your remembrances of your life with Dad. So she originally dictated it to Frederick, and she began with the world tour. And what's really interesting about her memoir is she loved being First Lady. In fact, she wanted him to run for a third term. And he didn't have the courage to tell her that he wasn't going to. He'd already written a letter to the Republican National Committee. So he called her into a cabinet meeting. And you have to remember, the cabinet meetings were on the same floor as where they lived. It wasn't until Theodore Roosevelt that the West Wing was built. So what's the Lincoln bedroom was the president's office and where he would have cabinet meetings. So he calls her across the hall, and he tells her when he tells the cabinet that he's not running again. She was furious with him. And he said, if I had told you, you would have tried to talk me out of it, and I don't want to be talked out of it. And so she cried when they finally left the White House and went back to Missouri. She cried almost the entire way back and said she felt like a waif with no home anymore. And he goes, Julia, I'm right here with you as a waif. We're in this together. And then she kind of calmed down. And then they did the world tour. But she realized that there were things that he had not put in his memoir that needed to be said, and that it didn't present a full picture of who he was and things about his life that he hadn't spoken about. So she starts dictating to Frederick. She then starts writing herself, and then she dictates to a couple friends. And it wasn't until John Simon, who you all know that name, he finally got them published in 1975 with the permission of the family. But she also wanted to set the record straight. And so her memoir does that in many ways. And there were a couple things she wanted to set the record straight on. One of them was his drinking. And she referred to letters that he had written to her, where somebody had given him a bottle of bourbon as some sort of gift. And he wrote to her and said, I gave it away and I am as sober as a deacon. And so she wrote about everything he had said to her personally. And then she wrote, she was just furious when he was running for office. And Sherman told her, be prepared for people to say terrible things about your husband that are not true. And she came in one day because she'd read something that the Democrats had put out. And it was like, how could they even begin to say this? And Ulysses is laughing about it and saying, this is politics. And so Sherman just said, just be prepared. And she eventually said she came to understand the approach her husband took. So she talked about his drinking. She quoted Lincoln in her memoir, where somebody had said something about, Grant being a drunkard. And he goes, well, if I would like to know what he's drinking so I can give it to all of my other generals, because he seems to be the only successful one here, and if that's what does it. So she has all this defense. We have to, 10:45? Yeah, I've got a couple minutes. I'm going to leave 10 minutes. Yeah, I'm ready. So just wanted to kind of put that in, these defenses of him. Also, she defended him even being a failure in St. Louis. And she basically gave explanations for why why farming didn't work. He talked about how he was not well, but worked his hardest. And she talked about, the people who weren't paying him. And so she gave these explanations that she felt needed to be made that he could not make for himself because they looked like excuses. And so and she even would document letters from other people to verify some of what she was doing to defend him. So that was the memoirs, that was her view, and she described him in defending when someone wrote, and there were also biographies of him coming out after the memoir. And one person had written a 2-volume set of his military history, and she wanted to correct some of that, where they said when he was out west, he was, drinking, he was slovenly, he was unkempt, and she goes, my general was always perfect. And so this was the way she defended him. So that was Julia's memoir, Julia's view. And like I said, they were different in some ways, but they were certainly alike in many others. And I'd just like, before I take questions, to read you the very last paragraph of her memoir. For nearly 37 years, I, his wife, rested and was warmed in the sunlight of his loyal love and great fame. And now, even though his beautiful life has gone out, it is as when some far-off planet disappears from the heavens. The light of his glorious fame still reaches out to me, falls upon me, and warms me. I mean, wouldn't every husband like their wife to write that? So there's Julia. Okay, all right. Questions, comments? The question is, did he mail the twice-kissed rose petals back to Julia? No, he kept them, because this was a piece of her he could have. But that would have been a nice trick, yeah. Oh, okay, very good question. When was the term First Lady used? We talk about this in the first chapter of both of our books. The first time First Lady was used to refer to a president's wife was when Dolly Madison died. Martha Washington was called Lady Washington. Abigail Adams was Mrs. President Adams, and people understood her role. Dolly Madison was Lady Presidentress. Can you imagine that one? And then when Julia Tyler came on the scene, she was the lovely Lady Presidentress. So First Lady was, when Dolly Madison died, Zachary Taylor gave a eulogy, and it was the first state funeral ever held in Washington was for Dolly Madison. And they shut down the government, and everybody showed up because she came back to Washington. She even had an honorary chair on the House floor, and she would go and listen to debate all the time. And so Harriet Lane, who was Buchanan's niece, in some article about her, she was referred to as a First Lady, but it didn't go on. They did it once in print on Mary Lincoln, and she said, no, I'm Mrs. Lincoln. She was some of the time Mrs. President Lincoln, too, when she signed letters. And It was really first used for Lucy Hayes. That was when it began to become popular in the press and when other people began referring to the president's wife. So it wasn't until after the Grants, and Hayes followed the Grants. So it was Julia's successor was the first. Okay, the question was about how he reacted to the man that Nellie chose to marry. As you know, that marriage did not go well. Julia being the optimist, Grant did not write about this himself, and there's nothing in any of the letters I've seen. Julia glossed over it. And the thing about Julia, she didn't talk about negative things. And so there's hardly anything in her memoir where she refers to that, and I have not seen anything that really says what he thought. Now, there may be biographies out there that I haven't read that do, but okay, she said the story is he sat on the bed and cried. Very likely. I mean, he was he was British for one thing. He had a reputation as a gambler, and so I can see where he was concerned. Julia does not write that in her memoir. Yeah. Oh, okay, very good question. What were the virtues that each of them loved or appreciated about the other? I think that final paragraph says one, loyalty. Ulysses Grant was loyal. And, her father tried to talk him into fighting for the South. But he was loyal to the Union, and she was going to be loyal with him. He was loyal to her. He was loyal to her family. Even though her father could be somewhat irascible, he was very loyal and very dedicated. So that was one of the things that she truly liked about him. The other was this shared love of nature. One thing in his memoir that impressed me, Julia talked a lot about the scenery and all of the fruit trees and everything out at the Dent estate. But he also wrote about the topography in Mexico and in Texas and the weather. And so they were both really tuned into that. And she appreciated that he really appreciated nature because she was very much a part of that. Their devotion to family, which is another form of the loyalty. She also saw him as a leader, and she really appreciated his leadership. And she saw him as a leader from the beginning. She thought he was destined for great things, along with her mother. With her, once again, her loyalty to him, her ability to cheer him up, her ability to keep him grounded, her sense of humor. And her naivete. She was incredibly naive. And she even writes about some of the funny things he does and says to her that come out of her naivety. And she could laugh at herself. And he appreciated that. Her zest for life. She was, very effusive. And when you read her book, her memoir, you really get this sense of this very effusive woman. But it countered some of his melancholy. Okay. Very good question. Yes, this was a finishing school. She hated math, which is interesting because, he wanted to be a math professor. That's what he really wanted to do, was go back to West Point, be a math professor. She did not do much needlepoint. She was not good at it because of her cross-eyed. You remember, she was cross-eyed, and that's why most of the photographs and portraits are profile. And when he became president, she offered to finally have the surgery that she had been dreading. And he goes, no, I fell in love with you the way you are, and don't change it now. It's kind of late. But no, in fact, there's a wonderful book by one of the members of our First Ladies Association on First Ladies needlepoint. And I can get that to you at the break because it traces them all. But Julia wasn't good at needlework because of her eyes, and also was not good at much domestic, but did the best she could. Okay, thank you all for your attention and great questions. You're welcome.